The wind across the Kansas plains carried stories. Stories of heroes, killers, and men who walked the thin line between both. One of those men was named Bat Masterson, the man who outlived the Wild West. He was not born with a gun in his hand or a badge on his chest. He was born Bartholomew Masterson in the cold winter of 1853 in Quebec, Canada. His family was poor but proud. His father, Thomas Masterson, was a hard-working farmer. His mother, Catherine, was strong and kind. Bat was one of 7 children, and like many frontier families, they moved often, always chasing a better life. When Bat was still young, the Mastersons packed up their few belongings and headed south, crossing rivers and fields until they reached Kansas. Kansas was not a gentle land. It was wild and open, filled with buffalo, outlaws, and dreamers. The Civil War had left scars on the land, and people carried guns not for sport, but for survival. In this rough new world, Bat learned fast. He learned to shoot straight, ride hard, and think faster than the next man. He became skilled with a rifle, hunting buffalo on the open plains with other young men trying to earn a living. The work was hard and dangerous. Storms could roll in without warning. Wolves and outlaws were never far away. But Bat was calm. He never panicked. His companions noticed something different about him, a quiet strength, a steady nerve. He didn't brag. He didn't rush. But when it mattered, he was always ready. By his early 20s, Bat had seen more of the frontier than most men twice his age. He had fought through blizzards, chased buffalo herds, and slept under the stars more nights than he could count. But he was still searching for something bigger than hunting or drifting from town to town. Then came Sweetwater, Texas, in the year 1876, the place where his name would first echo across the West. It started like so many tales of the Old West, with a card game and a disagreement over money. Bat was sitting in a smoky saloon, surrounded by the hum of voices, the smell of whiskey, and the sound of poker chips clicking. A man across the table accused him of cheating. Bat denied it, calm as always. But the man's hand went for his gun. The room froze. In a flash, there was a loud bang, and Bat felt a bullet tear into his hip. He fell, his chair crashing to the floor. Pain shot through his body like fire. The shooter stood, gun smoking, thinking the young man on the ground was finished. But Bat wasn't done. With blood running down his leg, he rolled over, pulled his own pistol, and fired. One shot. The man dropped where he stood. Silence filled the saloon. The young buffalo hunter from Kansas had just killed a man, and in that moment, Bat Masterson was born. Word spread quickly. "Did you hear about the kid from Kansas? Took a bullet and still shot the man dead." To some, he was a hero. To others, a killer. But one thing was clear. He was no ordinary man. After recovering from his wound, Bat left Sweetwater behind. He carried a cane from then on, a reminder of that bullet still lodged deep in his body. That cane became part of his legend, the gentleman's cane of a man who'd fought for his life and won. He traveled from town to town, working as a scout, a hunter, and sometimes a gun for hire. He met other names that would soon become famous: Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and Charlie Bassett. They were all men cut from the same cloth, brave, dangerous, and drawn to the edge of civilization. Bat's courage and cool head earned him respect. Unlike many gunfighters, he didn't drink heavily or shoot recklessly. He fought only when he had to, and when he did, he never missed. In 1876, Bat rode into Dodge City, Kansas, the most dangerous town in America. It was a wild place, full of saloons, dance halls, and gun smoke. Cowboys from Texas filled the streets after long cattle drives. Gamblers and outlaws filled the rest. The newspapers called it the wickedest little city in the West. But Bat saw something different. He saw a town that needed order, a town that needed men brave enough to stand up when others ran. He began working as a deputy sheriff under Charlie Bassett. Together with Wyatt Earp, they formed what people later called the Dodge City Peace Commission. They were lawmen with grit, but also with class. Bat was the kind of man who could stare a killer down without even drawing his gun, and still win. Dodge City changed him. It gave him a purpose. No longer just a drifter or a gambler, Bat Masterson became a protector, a symbol of justice in a world that barely knew the meaning of the word. Bat had walked through storms, fought for his life, and found something worth believing in. But the Wild West was only getting wilder, and every sunrise brought a new threat, a new test, a new grave. He had no idea yet that tragedy and greatness were both waiting for him in Dodge City. Bat Masterson's story: blood is spilled, a brother falls, and the law of the gun meets the heart of a man who's seen too much. When Bat Masterson rode into Dodge City, Kansas in 1876, the town was on the edge of chaos. It was a dusty place filled with cowboys, gamblers, and gunmen. Every night brought drunken fights, gunfire, and bodies carried out of saloons before sunrise. The town was booming from cattle money, but it was also drowning in lawlessness. Few men dared to wear a badge there. Those who did usually didn't live long. Bat was young, calm, and confident. He carried himself like a man who didn't fear trouble. People said he walked with a slight limp from the bullet he took in Sweetwater, and he used a fancy cane. But his limp didn't slow him down. It gave him style. He was tough, polite, and always neatly dressed, a strange mix of gentleman and gunslinger. In Dodge City, Bat found old friends. Charlie Bassett, one of the most respected lawmen in the region, wore the sheriff's badge. Wyatt Earp was another deputy. Together, they were the backbone of what people would later call the Peace Commission. They believed that a town could be tamed without turning it into a graveyard. Bat started as a deputy under Bassett. His job was simple but dangerous: keep the peace, stop the gunfights, and bring order to a place that didn't want it. He was patient but firm. He didn't draw his gun unless he had no choice. But when he did, no one doubted his aim. People soon learned that crossing Bat Masterson was a bad idea. Bat had a way with people. He could talk to a drunk cowboy as easily as to a city judge. He believed that most trouble could be stopped with words instead of bullets. But Dodge City was full of men who didn't listen to reason, and it was only a matter of time before blood was spilled again. When Bassett's term as sheriff ended in 1877, Bat ran for the job, and won. At only 23 years old, Bat Masterson became the sheriff of Ford County, which included Dodge City. It was a huge responsibility, but Bat faced it head-on. As sheriff, he cleaned up the streets with smart, fearless precision. He set up patrols, fined rowdy cowboys, and made it clear that the law now ruled Dodge City, not the gunmen. The newspapers started calling him Bat, short for Bartholomew, and the name stuck. It sounded sharp, like a bullet in flight. He also brought in his brothers, Ed and Jim Masterson, as deputies. The three Mastersons worked side by side, protecting the town together. They shared meals, laughed in the saloons, and kept each other's backs in every fight. For a while, it seemed the law had finally won. But the West had a cruel way of reminding men that peace never lasted long. One night in April 1878, Bat's brother Ed, who was serving as city marshal, was called to break up a fight at the Lady Gay Saloon. It was the kind of job he'd done 100 times before. Ed walked in calmly, trying to talk sense into a group of drunk cowboys causing trouble. Without warning, one of them pulled a gun and fired. The bullet hit Ed square in the chest. He staggered backward, firing his revolver as he fell, but it was too late. By the time Bat reached the saloon, his brother was lying in the dirt, barely breathing. He died moments later. For the first time in his life, Bat Masterson's calm cracked. He knelt beside his brother, blood soaking the dust, and made a promise under his breath. He would bring the killers to justice. The town braced for a bloodbath, but Bat didn't go on a wild rampage. He gathered his men, tracked down the suspects, and captured them alive. That's who Bat was. Even in grief, he believed in justice over vengeance. The killers were brought before the court, and Bat kept his word. After Ed's death, Dodge City changed for Bat. The streets that once felt like home now carried ghosts. The work no longer felt like victory. It felt like duty. Still, he stayed on as sheriff, keeping the peace and honoring his brother's memory. People across Kansas began to know his name. He was tough but fair, and his fame spread far beyond Dodge City. Reporters started writing about him, painting him as a fearless gunfighter and gentleman lawman. Some stories were true, others exaggerated, but all helped build the legend of Bat Masterson. As years passed, Bat's reputation grew. He became known for solving disputes without bloodshed and for facing danger with a calm smile. When gamblers, cowboys, or gunmen caused trouble, they often backed down after meeting his steady stare. He didn't have to shout. His name spoke louder than any gun, but deep inside, Bat was growing tired. He had seen too much death, too many friends buried before their time, The Wild West was changing, slowly turning into something else, a place where the gun was giving way to the law, and the legends were becoming stories told by firelight. By 1879, Bat left Dodge City for a while. He went to other towns, worked as a lawman in Colorado, and even tried his hand at running saloons and promoting prize fights. Yet no matter where he went, Dodge City remained a part of him, the place where he rose, fought, and lost his brother. People remembered him not just as another gunslinger, but as something rare, a man who could be both fierce and kind, both deadly and decent. Bat Masterson had faced the worst of the West and still stood tall. But his story was far from over. The days of law badges and gun smoke would fade, and a new chapter was waiting, one filled with love, loss, and a final journey eastward, far from the dusty streets that made him a legend. After the death of his brother Ed, Bat Masterson was never quite the same. He still wore the sheriff's badge, but something inside him had changed forever. The laughter in the saloons, the cheers from grateful townsfolk, none of it filled the emptiness he felt. Every time he walked down Front Street, he saw his brother's face, smiling one moment and gone the next. Dodge City was still dangerous, but it was beginning to calm. The cattle drive slowed down, and the wildest gunmen drifted away, chasing new trouble in other territories. The West itself was changing, and Bat could feel it. The days of quick draws and shootouts were fading into stories told over whiskey, but for Bat, peace didn't come easily. He had spent years living on the edge, hunting buffalo, facing down outlaws, and enforcing the law in one of the toughest towns in America. When the fighting stopped, life started to feel too quiet. He needed purpose again, so when a call for help came from Colorado in 1879, Bat answered. The mining town of Trinidad was falling apart, torn by corruption and violence. They needed a man who could bring order. They needed Bat Masterson. He packed his gun, his cane, and his reputation, and rode west once more. Trinidad was just as wild as Dodge had been. Gambling halls stayed open all night, and men settled arguments with bullets instead of words. Bat took the job as city marshal, determined to clean it up. And he did. His calm authority and sharp mind quickly restored order. Even the roughest men respected him, but peace was always temporary in Bat's world. Trouble seemed to follow him wherever he went. When his term ended, he returned to Dodge City again in 1881. The town had changed, but not for the better. A powerful group of gamblers and saloon owners had taken over, bullying citizens and threatening Bat's friends. The new mayor and city marshal were on their side. Word reached Bat that his friend Luke Short, a fellow gambler and gunman, was being run out of town. Bat didn't hesitate. He gathered some of the most famous names in the West, Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and Charlie Bassett, and rode back to Dodge. The newspapers called it the Dodge City War. When Bat and his men arrived, the town held its breath. Everyone expected a bloody showdown, the streets filled with armed men, fingers twitching near their holsters. For a few tense days, it looked like the West's most famous gunfighters would go to war. But Bat had changed. He didn't come to kill. He came to end the killing. He negotiated, argued, and reasoned until the city leaders backed down. Luke Short was allowed to stay, and the so-called war ended without a single shot fired. It was one of Bat's greatest victories, a fight won not with bullets, but with brains. That was the moment Bat truly began to understand who he was. He wasn't just a gunslinger or a lawman. He was a man of control, of balance. He could stop bloodshed without drawing his weapon. He could make enemies listen. But even with his reputation at its highest, Bat knew the world was moving on. The Old West he had known, the dusty trails, the open ranges, the lawless towns, was disappearing. The railroads were spreading. The telegraph wires were connecting cities. Civilization was pushing out the wild frontier. Bat could feel the change like a shift in the wind. He had spent his life bringing order to chaos, and now that chaos was fading away. So he did what many men of his time did. He adapted. He left law enforcement behind and turned to gambling and prize fighting. He became a promoter, organizing boxing matches and running saloons in places like Denver and Leadville, Colorado. He was smart, charming, and trusted by everyone, from cowboys to politicians. The newspapers still loved him. They wrote stories of the Gentleman Gunfighter, the man who tamed Dodge City and outwitted outlaws. Even when he wasn't wearing a badge, his legend grew. He also found love, a woman named Emma Walters, a singer and performer who had once graced the Denver stages. Emma was beautiful, bold, and independent, just the kind of woman who could match Bat's spirit. They married, and though life on the frontier was never easy, she stood by him through every turn of his restless journey. Together, they moved from town to town, following opportunity and adventure. Bat managed saloons, invested in mining operations, and promoted boxing matches. He became a familiar face in the sporting world, where people respected both his fairness and his sharp mind. He still carried his cane, that symbol of his past, but now it was part of his style, not his survival. The same calm confidence that had kept him alive in Dodge now helped him build a new life as a businessman. Yet deep down, Bat never completely left the lawman behind. He still believed in justice and loyalty. He still valued honor more than money. Even in gambling halls and boxing rings, he was the same man who once stood alone on a dusty street, facing down outlaws. By the early 1900s, Bat Masterson was no longer the gunfighter of the West. He was a man of the modern world, older, wiser, and still full of life. He had become something rare, a Western hero who survived long enough to see the Old West become history. He had outlived his enemies, outsmarted death, and turned his legend into a career. The newspapers began calling him the Gentleman of the West, but his story was far from finished. The frontier might have been gone, but Bat Masterson was about to start a new chapter, in the most unexpected place of all, New York City. When Bat Masterson left the rough towns of the West behind, he was not running away. He was simply ready for something new. He had faced down gunfighters, kept the peace in Dodge City, and survived more than most men ever would. The Wild West was shrinking fast, and Bat knew it. Railroads cut through the plains. Telegraph lines carried news faster than a horse could run. The frontier was closing, and a new kind of America was being born. By the early 1900s, Bat was in his 40s. His hair had begun to turn gray, but his sharp eyes and calm smile were still there. He no longer needed to prove himself with a gun. He had earned his legend. Now he wanted something different, a life where words mattered more than bullets. He and his wife, Emma Walters, settled for a time in Denver. There, Bat became a well-known figure in the world of boxing and sports. He managed fighters, promoted matches, and wrote columns for local newspapers. His voice carried weight because people trusted him. He was honest, witty, and always fair. When Bat said a fight was clean, the crowd believed him. It was during these years that Bat's charm and sense of humor began to shine. He was no longer the silent man with a revolver on his hip. He had become a storyteller. People would gather in saloons just to hear him talk, tales of buffalo hunts, shootouts, and long rides across the plains. But Bat never bragged. When others called him a hero, he smiled and changed the subject. He knew that real courage did not need applause. One of his friends once said that Bat had the rare gift of making peace without surrendering strength. That gift soon opened a new door, one that led far from the frontier. In 1902, Bat moved east to New York City, the biggest and busiest place in America. It could not have been more different from Dodge City. Instead of dust and gun smoke, there were crowds, carriages, and streetcars. The sound of gunfire was replaced by the noise of printing presses and the voices of newsboys shouting headlines. At first, New York must have felt strange. The man who once rode the open plains now lived in an apartment surrounded by brick buildings and electric lights. But Bat adapted quickly. He loved the energy, the noise, the feeling that history was being written every day. He joined the New York Morning Telegraph, one of the city's top newspapers, as a sports writer and columnist. His beat was boxing, a sport that was exploding in popularity. The same sharp instincts that once helped him survive gunfights now helped him read people. He could spot a fighter's courage or weakness with a single glance. His columns were funny, wise, and full of truth. Readers loved them. They called him the gentleman sporting writer. Bat wrote the way he lived, with fairness and honor. He refused to lie for money or twist facts to please anyone. If a boxer cheated, Bat said so. If a match was fixed, he called it out. And when a young fighter showed heart, Bat praised him like a proud father. His writing brought him fame again, but this time it was a quieter kind of fame, built on respect, not fear. People in New York soon learned that this man with the silver hair and soft voice had once been one of the deadliest gunfighters in the West. Some laughed, thinking it was just another tall tale. Then they saw the old revolver hanging in his office, and they realized it was true. Bat also made friends in high places. One of them was President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt admired men of action, and he considered Bat one of the last true frontier heroes. In 1905, the president appointed him a U.S. Deputy Marshal for the Southern District of New York. It was a high honor. The once young sheriff of Dodge City now carried a federal badge in America's greatest city. But Bat didn't chase criminals anymore. He mostly handled small official duties, wrote his newspaper columns, and enjoyed his evenings with Emma. The wild days were gone, and that was fine with him. He had earned peace. In his later years, Bat became a familiar figure in New York's sporting circles. He attended fights, dinners, and theater shows. People said he always wore a neat suit, polished shoes, and that same calm smile. He was polite to everyone, young reporters, famous athletes, and even critics who doubted his Old West stories. Sometimes, after a night of laughter and storytelling, Bat would walk home slowly through the city streets. The lights glowed on the wet pavement, and carriages rattled past. Perhaps he thought about the prairies he had once crossed, the faces of friends long gone, and the sound of the wind over the plains. But he never showed sadness. He was grateful for the life he had lived. On the morning of October 25th, 1921, Bat went to work as usual. He sat at his desk at the Morning Telegraph, writing his latest boxing column. His typewriter clicked steadily. He was describing a recent fight, analyzing each round with the precision of a man who had seen every kind of battle. Then, suddenly, the typing stopped. A few minutes later, a fellow reporter walked over and found Bat sitting quietly in his chair, his hat nearby, his last page still in the typewriter. His heart had given out. He had died doing what he loved, writing. The headline the next day read, "Bat Masterson dies at his desk." He was 67 years old. His death marked the end of an era. The last of the great lawmen of the Wild West was gone, yet he left behind more than stories of gunfights and glory. He left behind an example that even a man who once lived by the gun could grow, change, and find peace through words. Bat Masterson's life had come full circle. From a boy on the plains to a sheriff in Dodge City, from a gambler in Denver to a writer in New York, he had lived through the making of a nation. He had tamed both the frontier and himself, and in the end, he proved that true courage isn't just facing bullets. It's knowing when to lay the gun down and pick up the pen. When Bat Masterson died at his desk in 1921, the world barely paused. New York was racing forward into the Jazz Age. Cars replaced horses, radios replaced telegrams, and men who once carried six-shooters were now only names in yellowed newspapers. But even as the world changed, Bat's story refused to fade away. It had too much life, too much heart, and too much truth. For a while, only old friends and boxing fans remembered him. They told stories in smoky bars about the calm lawman who never lost his nerve. They spoke of the Dodge City days, of Bat and Wyatt Earp walking down dusty streets to face armed gangs without flinching. They told of the man who could talk his way out of a fight just as easily as he could win one. Then, slowly, the stories began to spread again, this time across America. Newspapers reprinted his old columns. Writers rediscovered his adventures. They called him the Gentleman Gunfighter, a title that fit him perfectly. He was not the fastest draw in the West, nor the most feared, but he was the most respected. He had lived through chaos without letting it poison his soul. Bat's legend grew because it was different. Most gunfighters were remembered for their kills. Bat was remembered for his restraint. He never glorified violence. He believed a man's strength was not in how quick he shot, but in how calm he stayed when others lost control. That quiet strength became his signature, and the reason his name lived on. In the 1930s and 40s, Western novels and dime stories brought his name back to life. Some of them exaggerated his adventures, turning him into a larger-than-life hero. They described him as unbeatable, always one step ahead, always the man who saved the day. The real Bat would have smiled at those stories, maybe even laughed, but he wouldn't have corrected them. He knew legends had their own way of growing. Then came Hollywood. In the 1950s, television discovered Bat Masterson all over again. The show Bat Masterson, starring Gene Barry, aired from 1958 to 1961. Millions of Americans tuned in every week to see the polished lawman with his cane and derby hat outsmart outlaws and charm ladies. The theme song said it all. He wore a cane and derby hat. They called him Bat Masterson. It was a romantic version of his life. A bit cleaner, a bit flashier, but it captured the spirit of who he really was. A man who used his brain before his gun. A man who valued honor above all else. Through the show, a whole new generation learned his name. To them, Bat Masterson wasn't just a man from history. He was the face of courage, style, and dignity in a violent world. Historians later worked to separate the myth from the man. They found that the real Bat was even more interesting than the Hollywood version. He was human, sometimes flawed, often brave, always steady. He never killed for sport or revenge. He preferred to wound or disarm rather than to kill. He believed in justice but not cruelty. In a time when many men settled disputes with blood, Bat believed in law and reason. Even in his letters and newspaper writings, you can see his intelligence and wit. He wrote about boxing with the same balance he used in his life: fair, clear, and thoughtful. He could be sharp-tongued when someone lied or cheated, but he was never cruel. He had the mind of a journalist and the heart of a lawman. What made Bat Masterson special was not just what he did, but how he lived. He adapted to change without losing his principles. When the West turned modern, he didn't cling to the past. He moved forward. He became a writer, a thinker, a symbol of the idea that men could grow with time. Even President Theodore Roosevelt saw something rare in him. Roosevelt once said Bat was a fine specimen of manhood, strong, disciplined, and decent. Coming from a president who loved rugged individuals, that was high praise. Today, Bat Masterson's name stands among the greats of the Old West: Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, Wild Bill Hickok, and Buffalo Bill Cody. But unlike many of them, Bat's story ends peacefully, not in violence. That makes his legacy even more powerful. He showed that you could live a hard life and still keep your heart clean, that you could walk through gunsmoke and still come out smiling. That being brave didn't mean being ruthless. Museums and history books now honor him as a man who bridged two eras: the lawless frontier and the modern age. His revolver, his cane, and his typewriter still survive in collections across America. Visitors stop to look at them, imagining the man who once held them, the lawman who became a writer, the fighter who found peace. His grave lies in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York. It's a quiet place, far from the deserts and plains where his legend was born. The simple headstone bears his name and the words, "Loved by the good, feared by the bad." That phrase says everything. It is the summary of a life that balanced strength with kindness, duty with decency. More than 100 years after his death, Bat Masterson remains one of the most fascinating figures in American history. His story still appears in films, documentaries, and podcasts. Writers and historians still debate his choices, his courage, and his mysterious calm under pressure. But one thing is certain: Bat Masterson was proof that legends don't have to die in gunfights. Some live on through words, honor, and the quiet power of character. He once said, "There are those who can live without wild things, and those who cannot." Bat Masterson was one who could not, but he learned to tame the wild, both around him and within him. And that is why his story endures, not as a tale of violence, but as a reminder that real strength is measured not by how fast a man draws his gun, but by how wisely he chooses when not to. Bat Masterson was never truly alone on the frontier. His story is woven together with the lives of men whose names also became legends: Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, Luke Short, and even Buffalo Bill Cody. These friendships shaped who he was and helped turn him from a local lawman into one of the most respected figures of the Old West. Bat first met Wyatt Earp in the 1870s, when both men were young, restless, and hungry for adventure. Dodge City was the place that brought them together, a noisy boomtown where courage was the only law that mattered. Wyatt was already known for his quiet strength and steady aim. Bat, only a few years younger, shared that same calm nature. They recognized something in each other immediately, an understanding that real bravery wasn't about shooting fastest, but about standing firm when others ran. The two became fast friends. They worked side by side, keeping Dodge's streets safe from drunks and outlaws. They didn't always agree on how to do it. Wyatt believed in intimidation, Bat in reason, but they respected each other deeply. In later years, when Bat had left Dodge and Wyatt had moved on to Tombstone, their bond never broke. They wrote letters, shared news, and defended each other in the press whenever critics tried to rewrite their past. One of Bat's closest companions was Luke Short, a gambler and gunfighter known for his sharp suits and quicker temper. Luke had a reputation for trouble, but he also had a sense of loyalty that Bat admired. When crooked politicians in Dodge tried to drive Luke out of town in 1883, Bat didn't hesitate. He rode back to Kansas with Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and several other old allies to stand by his friend. The newspapers called them the Dodge City Peace Commission, and their standoff became famous. It could have ended in a bloody shootout, but Bat's cool head and steady words diffused the situation. Luke stayed and no one died. It was Bat's style. Solve chaos with calm. Doc Holliday was another friend from those wild days. He was a dentist-turned-gambler, famous for his deadly skill and fragile health. Doc respected Bat for his fairness. Bat respected Doc for his loyalty. They were very different men, one wild and unpredictable, the other measured and polite, but somehow they understood each other. When Wyatt Earp later avenged his brothers after the OK Corral gunfight, Bat quietly supported him from afar, writing letters and offering advice. He knew what it meant to lose a brother, and he never judged Wyatt for doing what he thought was right. Among all these companions, Bat's relationship with Buffalo Bill Cody stood apart. Cody was a showman, a man who turned the West into entertainment for audiences across America and Europe. He created the famous Wild West show, a traveling spectacle with cowboys, Indians, and stage recreations of frontier battles. Bat admired Cody's ambition. The two met several times, and Cody often invited Bat to join the show, but Bat preferred the real world to the stage. Still, they shared mutual respect. Bat knew that Cody's show would keep the spirit of the frontier alive long after the guns fell silent. By the late 1880s, many of Bat's old friends had scattered. Some were dead. Others had disappeared into quiet lives. Wyatt drifted between Alaska and Los Angeles, still chasing fortune. Doc Holliday died young in Colorado, coughing his life away in a sanitarium. Luke Short was gunned down before 40. Only Bat seemed to have escaped the curse of the West, the early death that claimed so many who lived by the gun. When asked how he survived, Bat once joked, "I just learned when to walk away." But the truth was deeper. He had a sense of balance, of knowing when the fight was worth it and when it wasn't. That sense saved his life more than any bullet ever could. In New York, Bat often spoke fondly of his old companions. In his columns, he described them as brave men who fought their battles the best they could. He defended Wyatt Earp against critics who painted him as a murderer, saying Wyatt was a man who did what was needed when law was only a word. He remembered Luke Short as fearless but fair. Even Buffalo Bill, whom others called a self-promoter, Bat praised for giving America a connection to its own story. These friendships were more than nostalgia. They were symbols of a world that was disappearing. The West had given birth to men of action, but it also demanded that they change or die. Wyatt became a prospector, Cody a performer, and Bat a writer. Each found a new path, but they carried the same code: courage, loyalty, and a belief that justice mattered. Bat often said that the friendships he made on the frontier were worth more than gold dust. He knew that without them, he might never have survived the chaos of Dodge City or the loneliness of the plains. They weren't perfect men, far from it, but together, they had built something greater than themselves, a legacy of law and honor in a lawless land. When news of Bat's death reached Wyatt Earp in California, Wyatt was quiet for a long time. He finally said, "There was never a steadier man in a fight, nor a truer friend in peace." Those words, simple and sincere, were the greatest tribute a man like Bat could receive. Years later, when historians wrote about the heroes of the West, Bat was always there. Not because he killed the most men, but because he lived with integrity. His friendships became proof that the Wild West wasn't just a place of violence, but also of loyalty, brotherhood, and respect. Through every friendship and every farewell, Bat carried one truth: The measure of a man wasn't how many battles he won, but how many friends remembered him kindly when the guns went quiet. And in that way, Bat Masterson never truly died. His name lived on in the stories of those who stood beside him, the lawmen, the gamblers, and the dreamers who helped turn the dust and danger of the frontier into the legend we still remember today. By the time Bat Masterson settled in New York City, the man who had once chased outlaws across the plains was walking among politicians, writers, and sportsmen. The sound of gunfire was gone. Now his world was filled with typewriters, telephones, and the cheers of boxing crowds. The West was becoming a memory, but Bat had found a new frontier, one made not of dust and danger, but of words, wit, and reputation. To many New Yorkers, Bat was a mystery. Here was a man who had lived through gunfights, tamed Dodge City, and stood beside Wyatt Earp, now sitting quietly in a press box, taking notes at a prize fight. Some thought the stories were exaggerations, tall tales from a restless mind. Others, after meeting him, realized the truth. Bat Masterson was every bit as sharp, calm, and confident as the legend said. He simply no longer needed to prove it with a gun. He became a fixture in the city's sporting world, working for the New York Morning Telegraph as a sports writer and columnist. His column, usually focused on boxing, was known for its humor, intelligence, and honesty. Unlike many writers of the day, Bat didn't chase gossip or use flowery language. He wrote simply and clearly, much like he had lived, direct, fair, and to the point. Readers loved his words because they sounded like truth. They could almost hear the slow, confident voice of a man who had seen everything, who had lived through both chaos and calm. Bat wrote about fighters with the eye of a man who had been in real battles. He praised courage and discipline but despised arrogance and cheating. He had no patience for men who acted tough but lacked integrity. Bat's opinions carried weight. When he called a fight fair, fans believed him. When he said a boxer was overrated, people listened. He didn't bow to powerful promoters or wealthy backers. His loyalty was to the sport and to his readers, and that honesty made him one of the most trusted voices in journalism. His writing also showed glimpses of nostalgia. Sometimes, between the lines, he hinted at the world he had left behind, the wind across the Kansas plains, the laughter in the Dodge City saloons, the faces of friends long gone. But he never let sentiment turn into sadness. Bat accepted change as part of life. The frontier had ended, but his story had not. New York society adored him. He attended social gatherings, theater openings, and boxing dinners, always dressed in a crisp suit and polished shoes. The derby hat and cane that once symbolized his time in Dodge now marked him as a man of refinement. People called him Colonel Masterson, a title of respect more than rank. He moved easily between worlds, a frontier hero turned modern gentleman. At dinners, he often told stories from his lawman days. He never exaggerated and he avoided bragging. Instead, he told them with quiet humor, as if those deadly moments were just small adventures in a long, surprising life. Listeners hung on every word. One reporter wrote, "When Bat Masterson speaks, even the loudest room goes silent." Among those who admired him was President Theodore Roosevelt. The two men met in the early 1900s, and Roosevelt quickly saw in Bat a reflection of his own ideals: courage, discipline, and integrity. Roosevelt loved men who had lived real lives, who had faced danger and kept their honor intact. In 1905, he appointed Bat as a U.S. Deputy Marshal for the Southern District of New York, a position Bat held proudly for years. Though his duties were light, the title carried meaning. It connected the dusty past of Dodge City with the modern electric age of New York. The man who once stood with Wyatt Earp now walked the same streets as Roosevelt and Pulitzer. It was as if the frontier itself had followed Bat into the future. Even as he aged, Bat kept his sharpness. His eyes still carried that same calm strength that had once frozen outlaws in their tracks. His hair turned silver, but his spirit never dimmed. Younger reporters often sought his advice, and Bat would smile and tell them, "Always tell the truth. It's the easiest story to remember." He became something rare, a living link between two eras. In an age of factories and newspapers, Bat reminded people that courage and honor still mattered. His readers didn't just see him as a writer. They saw him as a symbol of what America had been and what it still could be. Yet behind the charm and success, there was a quiet awareness that time was moving on. The old friends were gone. Wyatt Earp was growing old out west. Doc Holliday and Luke Short were long dead. Even the towns Bat once rode through were now modern cities with paved streets and electric lights. The world he helped build no longer needed men like him, but Bat never complained. He had found peace in his new purpose. Every morning, he walked to his office at the Morning Telegraph, greeting clerks, editors, and reporters along the way. He'd sit at his desk, light a cigar, and begin typing his column, tapping steadily on the keys, just as he once fired shots on the frontier. Calm, precise, and without waste. People said his desk was always spotless. His manner always polite, and his deadlines never missed. In a business full of noise, Bat worked quietly and consistently, just as he had lived. Those who met him in those final years described him as kind but firm, funny but wise, a man who carried history in his eyes but hope in his heart. He no longer needed to prove his strength. It was written into every line of his life. Bat Masterson had done something few men ever achieved. He had conquered the Wild West, then conquered time itself by adapting to the modern world. He had become not just a survivor, but a symbol of transformation, proof that the past and the present could live together in one man. And though he might not have said it aloud, Bat must have known that his journey was complete. He had turned the story of a lawman's life into the story of a nation's growth, from dust and danger to dignity and progress. Soon, the man who once brought order to Dodge City would meet his quiet end in the heart of New York. But before that final day, Bat continued to live each one with grace, discipline, and a smile, the same way he had faced every challenge that life ever threw at him. The morning of October 25, 1921 began like any other for Bat Masterson. He woke early, as he always did, dressed neatly in his dark suit, and put on his hat. Outside his New York apartment, the city was alive with noise. The rumble of streetcars, the calls of newspaper boys, the endless hum of progress. The world had changed beyond recognition since his days in Dodge City, yet Bat moved through it with the same calm stride he had always carried. He was 67 now, but his back was still straight, his eyes still sharp. The years had touched him gently. He no longer carried a revolver. His weapon now was his pen, his words, his reputation. He had lived long enough to see himself become a legend, and that, he knew, was no small miracle. As he walked toward the New York Morning Telegraph building, he passed the usual crowd, clerks hurrying to work, news vendors shouting headlines, and cab drivers waving for fares. Some recognized him and nodded politely. To most, he was just another well-dressed gentleman. Few knew that this quiet man had once stood face to face with gunfighters and outlaws, that his hands had drawn a revolver faster than most men could think. Inside the newspaper office, Bat greeted his colleagues with a smile and a short nod. His routine never changed. Hang up his hat, light a cigar, and sit down at his desk by the window. The other writers admired him, though most were too young to remember his glory days. To them, he was the calm, dignified old-timer who typed faster than anyone else in the room. On that day, he began writing his latest column, a detailed piece about a recent boxing match. His fingers moved steadily across the typewriter keys, striking in rhythm, each word carefully chosen. He analyzed the fight round by round, describing courage, timing, and the will to win, qualities he understood better than anyone. Those who worked nearby later said he seemed especially peaceful that morning. His face was relaxed, his expression thoughtful. Every few minutes he paused, leaned back, and smiled faintly as if remembering something far away, maybe a dusty Kansas street, or a friend long gone. He didn't know it. But this would be the last story he would ever write. At around noon, the sound of his typewriter stopped. For a few moments, no one noticed. Then a colleague walked over, perhaps to ask him a question, and saw Bat sitting motionless in his chair. His head rested gently against the backrest, one hand on the desk, the other on the typewriter. He looked peaceful, almost asleep, but Bat Masterson was gone. The doctor said it was a heart attack, sudden, quiet, merciful. He had died doing what he loved most, working, writing, and thinking. The newsroom fell silent. Reporters who had faced deadlines and chaos every day stood frozen, staring at the man who had once faced bullets and never blinked. Someone gently removed the last page from his typewriter. The final line he had written read, "There are no second chances in the ring." Those words seemed fitting. They could have described his life just as easily as the sport he covered. Bat had always lived like a fighter, calm, disciplined, ready for whatever came next. News of his death spread quickly. Newspapers across the country printed obituaries remembering the lawman, the gunfighter, and the writer. Headlines read, "Bat Masterson, last of the Old West, dies at his desk." In New York, people who had known him as a journalist were shocked to learn about his past. They read about Dodge City, the buffalo hunts, the gunfights, and his friendship with Wyatt Earp. It seemed almost impossible that the quiet man from the sports pages had once been part of that violent, distant world. In Kansas and Colorado, old-timers nodded sadly. They remembered the sheriff who had walked the streets without fear, who had faced down killers and still smiled kindly at strangers. To them, Bat's passing marked the end of something greater, the final curtain on the Old West itself. Wyatt Earp, now an old man living in California, received the news with heavy silence. He told a reporter later, "There never was a man with a steadier nerve or a kinder heart." For Wyatt, losing Bat was like losing the last living piece of his youth. Bat's funeral was small but dignified. He was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, surrounded by the stillness of trees instead of the howling wind of the prairie. On his gravestone were carved the words that summed up his life perfectly: loved by the good, feared by the bad. Emma, his wife, stood quietly by the grave. She had shared decades with him, through dusty trails, smoky saloons, and the shining streets of New York. She knew better than anyone what kind of man he had been. Strong but gentle, brave but humble, a man who could fight when he had to, and walk away when he should. After his death, letters poured in from across the country. Old friends, boxers, lawmen, and writers all shared memories of the man they admired. They spoke of his honesty, his courage, and his rare ability to live honorably in two completely different worlds, the savage West and the civilized East. Bat Masterson's final chapter closed without drama, without gunfire, and without regret. He had lived through the most dangerous time in American history and had managed to leave it behind without bitterness. His was not the story of a man destroyed by violence, but of one who mastered it and then outgrew it. He had seen the end of the Wild West and the rise of modern America. He had watched men trade revolvers for typewriters, horses for cars, and campfires for electric lights. And he had kept pace with all of it, steady, graceful, unbroken. In his life, Bat Masterson had done what few men ever could. He turned legend into truth and truth into legacy. He proved that a man's story doesn't have to end where it begins, that even a gunslinger can become a gentleman, and that courage doesn't fade with age. As the city lights flickered that night, somewhere above the noise and motion, the spirit of the frontier rested, and maybe, just maybe, the wind that once blew across the plains carried one last whisper of his name: Bat Masterson, the man who outlived the Wild West. When Bat Masterson died in 1921, many believed his story would fade quietly into history, another name in the long list of lawmen and gunfighters who had once ruled the frontier. But the truth was very different. Death did not end Bat's story. It gave it room to grow. In the years that followed, his name began to rise again, carried on the wind of nostalgia for the Old West. America was changing fast. Skyscrapers replaced saloons, automobiles replaced horses, and cities swallowed the plains. Yet people still longed for stories of courage, honor, and simplicity. They missed the time when one man's word was his law, and when justice was carried on a hip instead of hidden in paperwork. Bat Masterson's story fit perfectly into that longing. He was different from the usual legends of the West. He wasn't reckless like Wild Bill Hickok or ruthless like Jesse James. He was calm, intelligent, and fair, a man who didn't seek violence but met it with courage when it came. His blend of dignity and toughness fascinated writers, filmmakers, and historians for decades to come. In the 1920s and 1930s, old friends and journalists began retelling his life in books and magazines. They wrote about his friendship with Wyatt Earp, his shootouts, and his remarkable shift from sheriff to sports writer. The stories weren't always accurate. Some added drama. Others softened the edges, but all agreed on one thing. Bat Masterson was a man who had lived many lives and survived them all. The Hollywood era of the 1940s and 1950s brought Bat back into the spotlight in a way he could never have imagined. The public couldn't get enough of westerns, and the film industry turned frontier legends into movie heroes. Actors portrayed him as a dashing gunfighter who walked with a cane and wore a derby hat, the image most Americans would come to associate with his name. Then came television. In 1958, NBC launched the hit show Bat Masterson, starring Gene Barry. For 3 years, millions of viewers tuned in weekly to watch the Gentleman Gunfighter bring law and order to the Old West without ever losing his cool. The show presented Bat as clever, smooth-talking, and always one step ahead of the bad guys. He preferred brains over bullets, charm over force, a true gentleman in a violent world. It wasn't exactly the real story, but it captured Bat's spirit perfectly. He had always been that man, calm, confident, and unwilling to let anger guide him. The show's theme song became famous, describing him as the man who could outsmart, outshoot, and outthink any outlaw alive. Children began wearing derby hats and pretending to be Bat Masterson on playgrounds across America. His legend was reborn, brighter than ever. Meanwhile, historians continued to study the truth behind the myth. They found old letters, newspaper clippings, and first-hand accounts that revealed the real Bat. Not a flawless hero, but a deeply human one. They discovered how he used reason more than rage, and how he often avoided bloodshed when others would have fired first. In a world obsessed with violence, Bat's restraint became the most heroic thing about him. Writers described him as a bridge between two worlds, the rough, lawless West and the civilized, modern America that came after. He was proof that even in a violent time, decency and intelligence could prevail. The gunfighter who became a journalist had shown that courage didn't end when the shooting stopped. It simply took on a new form. In the decades that followed, Bat's story continued to appear in books, documentaries, and films. He was portrayed in countless movies, often alongside Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday. Each version painted him slightly differently, sometimes as a gunslinger, sometimes as a thinker, sometimes as a man who wanted peace in a world that didn't understand it. But in every version, one thing remained constant. Bat was always the man who stood tall, calm, and unshaken when others panicked. In the 1980s and 1990s, historians began to appreciate Bat not only as a lawman but also as a symbol of American transformation. He represented what the country itself had gone through, from wild chaos to order, from survival to sophistication. The same man who once stared down killers in Dodge City had later sat beside presidents and reporters in New York City. That journey mirrored America's own rise from frontier to modern nation. Today, visitors can find Bat Masterson's name in museums and history books, in old photographs and preserved revolvers, in articles and television reruns. His grave in Woodlawn Cemetery, surrounded by trees and silence, is still visited by those who admire what he stood for. On his simple headstone, the words remain, "Loved by the good, feared by the bad." Modern readers and filmmakers see Bat as more than just a Western hero. He is a symbol of adaptability, proof that a person can grow beyond their past without denying it. His story reminds us that bravery isn't about how fast you draw your gun, but how well you control your fear. It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. Even more, Bat's life teaches that legends don't have to die young to be remembered. Many of his contemporaries, Doc Holliday, Billy the Kid, Wild Bill Hickok, met violent ends. Bat didn't. He lived long enough to watch the West he knew disappear, and he accepted it with grace. That endurance gave his legend a deeper meaning. He wasn't just the last of the gunfighters. He was the first of the modern men. In an age when the world romanticizes rebellion, Bat Masterson stands out as something rarer, a hero of balance. He fought when he had to, but never for glory. He lived for purpose, not fame. And when history changed around him, he changed with it. The legend of Bat Masterson still rides quietly through time, in films, songs, and the imagination of anyone who believes that courage, intelligence, and honor can coexist in one man. Long after the gun smoke cleared and the saloons turned to dust, the name still whispers through history, Bat Masterson, the man who outlived the Wild West and became the gentleman who wrote its final chapter. Time has a way of turning men into myths. It smooths the rough edges, blurs the scars, and leaves behind only what the world chooses to remember. For Bat Masterson, that memory has never truly faded. More than a century after his death, his story still feels alive, not because of how many gunfights he won, but because of the kind of man he became. Bat's journey was more than the tale of a gunslinger or lawman. It was the story of transformation, a man who walked through the most violent years of America's history and emerged with his dignity intact. He began as a restless boy chasing buffalo across the plains, became a sheriff who faced chaos without fear, and ended his days as a writer in the heart of New York City. Few men covered such ground in one lifetime. Even in death, Bat's legacy speaks to something deeper than the Old West itself. His life reminds us that true strength is calm, that real courage is quiet, and that a man's worth is not measured by the number of fights he wins, but by the way he carries himself through every storm. He lived through an age when violence was common and mercy was rare. Yet Bat chose balance. He carried a gun but used his words first. He wore a badge but never abused it. He saw blood and loss but never let them harden his heart. In a time when legends were often born from bloodshed, Bat built his name on honor and restraint. Many of his peers burned out early, consumed by the wildness of their own lives. But Bat learned how to adapt, how to move forward as the world changed around him. When the West turned into cities and railroads, he didn't cling to the past. He stepped into the future. The boy from the frontier became a gentleman of the city, the lawman became a journalist, and the gunfighter became a thinker. That transformation, from chaos to civility, mirrored America itself. The young nation that had once fought for every inch of its land was learning to build, write, and reflect. In a way, Bat Masterson's life was the story of the United States growing up. Yet behind his quiet smile, Bat never forgot where he came from. Even in his later years, sitting behind a typewriter, he carried a touch of the frontier inside him. When he wrote about boxers, he spoke of their courage the same way he once spoke of the men who stood beside him in Dodge City. He admired anyone who faced fear with grace. That was the thread that tied every chapter of his life together. Grace under pressure. If someone asked him about his past, Bat never glorified it. He didn't boast about the men he'd faced or the times he'd been shot. He simply said, "A man does what he must do." To him, heroism wasn't something to brag about. It was something to live quietly, every day. After his death, writers, historians, and filmmakers turned him into something larger than life. Yet, beneath all the stories, one truth remained constant. Bat Masterson was a man of control, compassion, and class. He showed that even in a violent world, decency was still possible. Over time, the name Bat Masterson came to symbolize a certain kind of man, brave, fair, and unshakable. The kind who keeps his word, stands his ground, and faces danger without hate. It's why his story has lasted so long. He didn't just survive history. He defined it. Today, when people walk through museums or read about the Old West, they see his photograph. The calm eyes, the trimmed mustache, the neat suit. He doesn't look like a killer or a legend. He looks like a man who understood himself. And maybe that's what makes his image so powerful. Bat was real. He was proof that legends can have gentle hearts. The world he knew is gone now. The dusty towns, the endless plains, the echo of boots on wooden sidewalks. But his spirit lives on wherever courage and character still matter. His story has become part of a much bigger one, the eternal story of people learning to rise above their pasts. In every generation, there are those who stand between two worlds, the old and the new, the wild and the civilized. Bat was one of them. He didn't just outlive the Wild West. He helped close it with dignity and grace. When we look back at his life, we don't just see gunfights or badges. We see evolution, a man growing wiser, softer, and stronger all at once. His legend teaches that change isn't weakness. It's the highest form of courage. Standing at his grave today, surrounded by the quiet of Woodlawn Cemetery, it's easy to imagine the sound of the prairie wind, the same wind that once blew through Dodge City, whispering across the plains. It carries the echoes of an age long gone, and perhaps the faintest trace of his name, Bat Masterson, the man who saw the world turn from wilderness to civilization, and found his place in both. The lawman who faced death and chose life, the gunslinger who learned to write, the legend who never had to shout to be remembered. More than a century later, his story continues to speak, not as a tale of violence, but as a lesson in humanity. Because every man, in his own way, faces a frontier, and like Bat, we all must learn when to fight, when to forgive, and when to lay down our weapons and move forward. In the end, Bat Masterson's greatest victory wasn't in a gunfight or on a printed page. It was in proving that a man can live many lives and still stay true to himself, and so his story endures. Steady, timeless, unbroken. Just like the man himself.